The notice had been tacked to the board outside the post office in Hartwell for 11 days before she finally copied down the address. She had walked past it 6 times that she counted, and probably more that she had not. It was not a long notice. Someone had written it in a careful hand that pressed a little harder on the downstrokes, the way people do when they are trying to say something they mean. He had a flour mill outside of town, the notice said, on the Canmore Fork, 12 miles north on the Palliser Road. The work was steady and honest. He needed someone who could keep accounts and was not afraid of early mornings. He had written that last part without apology, which she appreciated. Most men who wrote notices like this softened the parts that were actually hard. She was 32 years old. She had come down to Hartwell from Medicine Hat in the 3rd week of September with a trunk of practical things and a wooden box she used as a writing desk, the hinges replaced twice. She had been taking in mending and copying letters for a solicitor's office since her husband died in the spring. Her husband had been a good man, and his death had left her precise in a way she had not been before, clear-eyed about what she needed and quieter about most everything else. She stood at the notice board a final time on a Tuesday morning, with frost still on the awning above her, and copied the address down on the inside of her wrist because she had not brought paper. Then she went back to the room she rented above the dry goods store and wrote a letter and posted it before she had time to reconsider. His reply came 9 days later. It was 3 sentences. He had received her letter. If she was still interested, he could send the wagon on Saturday. If Saturday did not suit her, he would arrange another time. That was all. No warmth, no practiced reassurance. She read it twice and then set it on the writing box and looked at it from across the small room. She packed on Friday. The wagon came early, driven by a boy of about 16, who said his name was Harwick and who had the blunt social confidence of someone raised in a place where there was simply too much to do to spend time on ceremony. He loaded her trunk without being asked and her wooden box separately and handled it carefully when she said to. They drove north without much conversation. The road curved out of town and the country opened up fast the way it does in the foothills, the mountains appearing to the west suddenly and staying there, so large that after a while you stopped registering them the way you stop registering a sound that doesn't change. She watched the land. It was good land, she thought, in the way that land with water in it is good. The grass still carrying some color, even in late September, the creek lines visible as darker threads across the valley floor. Harwick pointed out the mill from the crest of a long slope before they descended, and she looked at it without saying anything. It was bigger than she had expected. 3 stories of timber and stone, with the wheels still turning in the morning light, the creek running clear below it. A house set back from the mill with a covered porch, an equipment shed, a smaller building she took to be storage or a bunkhouse. The whole operation had the look of something that had been built carefully, over years, by someone who understood that the first thing you put up determined the shape of everything after. She noted the wheel. It was turning. That meant the water was still running well into autumn, which meant the mill ran late in the season, which meant more income than a mill that shut down in August. She noted the stack of sacked flour visible through the open shed doors. She noted that the fencing around the yard was in good repair. She had grown up on a grain farm in Manitoba. Flour mills were not strangers to her. He came out of the mill when they pulled in, wiping his hands on a cloth that he pushed into his back pocket without thinking about it. He was perhaps 40, perhaps less. Broad through the shoulders, with the particular economy of movement of a man who was not thinking about how he moved, because he was thinking about the work. He had dark hair going gray at the temples and a face that had taken a lot of weather. He looked at the wagon, and then at her, and she had the feeling he was arriving at a conclusion he had already partially reached. He said, "You made good time." She said, "The road was dry." He looked at her a moment, not the way a man sometimes looks at a woman to decide how she fits into a story he's already written. He looked at her the way she'd seen experienced people look at something they were genuinely trying to understand. Then he said, "The room is at the back of the house. East-facing. Harwick can bring your things." She climbed down from the wagon before anyone offered to help. The room was small and clean. A window looked east over the equipment shed and past it to a long field that ran toward the creek. The light in the morning would come straight through. The floor was plank, sanded smooth, and there was a hook behind the door and a washstand with a china basin that had a crack in the rim, repaired with some kind of gray resin that had held. Someone had made that repair carefully. She counted it as a point in the house's favor. She unpacked the way she always unpacked. Practical things first, her extra shirtwaist hung on the hook, her account ledgers and pen case on the windowsill, her small tin of dried lavender and her bone-handled letter opener placed side by side, because she had learned long ago that small order at the edges of a day helped with the larger disorder. When she came out into the kitchen, she found the stove cold. It was midday. She found wood in a box beside the back door and kindling under a piece of canvas in the lean-to. She built the fire without asking permission. He found her there when he came in an hour later, the water heating, a pot of dried peas already soaking on the shelf. He stood in the doorway. She said, "The peas need until tonight. I'll make something else for this afternoon." He came inside and looked at the stove and then at her. She had the sense he was recalibrating something. He said, "You don't have to start that yet," she said. "The stove needs to be warm regardless." He took his hat off and hung it on the post. He washed his hands at the basin and sat at the table, and she noted he sat with his back to the wall, facing both the door and the window at once, a habit so old he probably did not know he had it anymore. Harwick came in a few minutes later and sat across from him. They ate without ceremony and did not talk much. She listened to the shape of their silence. It was the silence of two people who had been managing something difficult for long enough that they had stopped discussing it, which is different from peace but can look like it from the outside. After, both of them brought their plates to the basin. She had not expected that. She spent the first week learning the shape of the operation. The mill ran on wheat from 3 farms to the north and barley from a cooperative that had formed the year before. There was a contract with a bakery in Canmore and a standing order from the Hudson's Bay post at the river crossing. The accounts, when she asked to see them, were kept in a ledger that was accurate but not organized in a way that made it easy to read quickly. She sat with it for 2 evenings without saying anything. On the 3rd evening, he came into the kitchen and found her at the table with the ledger and a separate piece of paper where she had been reorganizing the columns. He stood at the edge of the lamp's light and looked at what she had done. She said, "I'm not changing anything, just reordering it so you can see what you need to see without going through 3 entries." He was quiet for a moment. Then he pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. He said, "Show me." She showed him. He followed without interrupting, which she respected. Most men interrupted with reassurances when they didn't understand something, or with disagreements when they did. He just looked. When she finished, he said the spring had been a problem. She asked what kind of problem. He said the water level on the creek had dropped enough in July that the wheel had slowed, and they had lost 2 weeks of capacity at the worst time of year, when the harvest wheat was coming in. She looked at the ledger. She could see it now in the numbers, a gap in the Canmore contract that corresponded to late July and early August, a note in the margin that said only delay. She said, "How deep is the intake channel?" He looked at her. She kept her eyes on the ledger. He said it had not been dredged since his father built it. That was 23 years ago. She said, "If the channel silts up, the wheel loses pressure even if the creek is running normally." He said nothing. She had the sense this was not new information to him, but was information he had been postponing. She said, "I'd like to see it." He showed her the intake the next morning before the wheel was set running. The channel ran from a point 30 feet upstream of the wheel, stone-lined on both sides and across the bottom, cut deep enough to hold pressure even in low water. Or it had been. She could see from the bank that the bottom had silted up considerably. The silt pale and packed, narrowing the channel from what should have been 3 feet of depth to something closer to 18 inches in the worst sections. She crouched at the bank. She pressed 2 fingers into the silt at the edge. It gave about an inch and stopped dry underneath, which meant it had been compressing for years, not months. She said, "What does 2 weeks of lost capacity cost you in a good harvest year?" He said a number. She had already estimated something close to it from the ledger. She said, "And how long since you've had a full summer run?" He said, "Before my father died, probably." She stood and looked at the channel for another moment. Then she looked at the wheel, which was still waiting. Then back at the channel, she said, "It's a 3-day job if the weather holds." He looked at her for a moment and she recognized the expression. It was the expression of someone who had known something needed doing and had decided, at some point she couldn't place, that knowing was the same as having done it, that the weight of the thought was sufficient acknowledgement of the task. She did not say that. She said, "Do you have a long-handled spade and something narrow enough to get between the stones?" He said he did. He said it quietly, and she went back toward the house to change into the clothes she wore for this kind of work. They started at the far end, upstream, which was the right way to do it, so the loosened silt ran downstream and out, rather than resettling into the section you had just cleared. She knew this because her father had taught her, the same way he had taught her everything practical. By showing her once entirely and trusting her to have paid attention, she nearly always had. The work was hard. The packed silt came up in heavy layers and the stone lining required a particular angle to get the spade in without striking the mortar. She learned the channel quickly, the way she learned most things, by doing it until it told her its own pattern. By the end of the first morning, she knew where the worst sections were and how to approach them without losing half the load. He worked alongside her without comment. He was stronger than she was, and some of the sections required more leverage than she had, and he took those without discussion, just stepped in and adjusted the angle and worked until the section cleared, then stepped back. She noticed he did not look to see if she was watching when he did this. He was not demonstrating. He was simply working. Harwick brought them dinner at noon and sat at the bank eating his own and watching them without much expression. After a while, he said, "It's deeper than it looks." She said, "Most things are." He thought about that and then went back to eating. By the end of the second day, they had cleared 2/3 of the channel. The wheel, which they had set running that evening just to check, had noticeably more pressure. She could hear it in the sound, the wheel moving with a consistency it had not had in the morning. He came and stood beside her at the wheel housing and listened, and she did not think he needed her to say anything about what that sound meant. He said, "The last section is under the footbridge." She said she knew. She had seen it from the bank that morning and already had a thought about how to approach it, a narrower tool at a lower angle, and she told him so. He listened without interrupting. Then he said he thought she was right about the angle. She said they would know in the morning. They walked back to the house in the last light. She was tired in the clean way of work that had gone as it was supposed to go. At the pump, she washed her hands and face and came into the kitchen and found he had set the coffee on without asking whether she wanted any. She sat at the table. He set a cup beside her and went to the window and looked out at the wheel, which they had left running, and she could hear it from here, the low, even rhythm of it, and she thought that was a good sound, one of the better sounds she knew. She wrapped both hands around the cup and did not say anything. He stayed at the window for a time, and then he came and sat across from her, and the lamp between them made the kitchen seem smaller and warmer than it was. The last section took most of the morning, as she had known it would. The footbridge complicated the angle, and there were 3 courses of stone along the north side that had shifted and needed to be reset before the channel would hold properly. He went to the equipment shed for the smaller pry bar and the mortar, and she worked the silt loose while he was gone, careful not to disturb the shifted stones more than they already were. He came back and crouched at the edge and looked at the stones and then at her and said she had read it correctly. She said, "Your father built this well." He was quiet a moment. He said, "He built most things to last." She said, "I can tell." He looked at her briefly. She went back to the channel. He began setting the stones. By early afternoon, the wheel was running at full capacity for the first time since she had arrived. She could feel the difference in the floor of the mill, a faint vibration that had been absent before, the millstones turning with a confidence the mechanism had not shown. She stood in the mill doorway and felt it and did not say anything about it. He came and stood beside her. After a while he said, "The Canmore order runs through to December if the water holds." She said, "It will hold." He looked at her. She said, "The silt was the problem. The creek has enough volume. You just weren't getting it to the wheel." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My father used to say that most problems in a mill are problems you can see coming and choose not to." She said, "Mine said something like that about grain." He turned and looked at her, and it was the first time since she had arrived that she felt he was seeing her as something other than a useful arrangement. She was not sure what to do with that. She filed it away the way she filed most things she did not yet know how to name. October came in with cold nights and clear days, the mountains sharp against a sky that had gone the deep flat blue of altitude. The harvest wheat was coming in from the north farms, and the mill ran from before dawn until the light failed. She kept the accounts, and managed the correspondence, and learned the names of the farmers by their handwriting before she learned them by their faces, because the orders came in by letter, and the men came in by wagon, and the letters came first. There was a man named Gavlock who grew winter wheat on the northeast quarter, and brought in the largest yields of anyone on the route. There was a woman named Strathmore who managed her late husband's farm alone, and whose letters were the most precisely written of anyone she dealt with, the figures exact, the dates confirmed in advance. She wrote back to Mrs. Strathmore in kind. When Miss Strathmore came in person in the second week of October, she looked at the new account columns and said, "This is better organized than before." She said the previous system was accurate. Mrs. Strathmore said, "Accurate and useful are not the same thing." She said it pleasantly, as a statement of fact, and left with her receipts. He had been at the mill door when this exchange happened. He said nothing about it afterward, but that evening she caught him looking at the ledger while she was at the stove, reading through the new columns with the same focused attention he brought to the wheel housing and the gate mechanisms. She thought that was something. She did not say so. The first hard frost came at the end of October. She found the rain barrel frozen in the morning and broke the skin with the heel of her palm, one clean strike, the cold coming up through her hand and staying there while she carried water into the kitchen. He was already at the mill. She could see the lamp in the high window. She built the fire and put the porridge on and wrapped herself in her work coat to go check the small things that needed checking in cold weather. The rain barrel was not the only one. She checked the pump handle, which had a tendency to seize, and worked a little grease into it from the tin she had found in the lean-to. She checked the stack of sacked flour in the storage building, which needed to stay dry and did. She found a place at the south corner where the roof overhang had let some moisture in, and noted it in the small book she kept in her coat pocket for this kind of thing. When she came back in, he was at the table with his boots still on, and a cut on his left hand from the wheel housing he had been adjusting. She put a cloth and the tin of iodine on the table without comment. He looked at it. Then he held out his hand and she cleaned it and wrapped it and tied it off, and the whole thing took less than 2 minutes. He said, "There's a section of sluice gate that's going to need replacing before spring." She said, "I know. I saw it last week." He looked up at her. She said, "I put it in the book. It's toward the top of the list." He said, "You have a list." She said, "Things need a list or they wait for the wrong moment." He held her gaze for a second longer than he had before. Then he looked at his coffee. She sat down across from him with the account book, and they talked through the repairs while they ate. It was the longest conversation they had had. She noticed he brought the same quality of attention to the repair discussion that he brought to everything else. No performance, no filler. He said what he knew and asked about what he did not. And when she had thought about something he had not, he adjusted without making an occasion of it. After he went back to the mill, she sat for a moment with her hands around her cup and the account book open in front of her. Outside the window, the frost had come off the grass, and the field behind the equipment shed was a pale gold in the morning light, the individual blades standing separate and still. She was 32 years old. She had spent 4 years becoming someone she had not expected to become, not unhappy, but narrowed, careful in the way of a person who has learned that some losses do not announce themselves in advance, and so you stop expecting announcement. She was not sure anymore that was the only way to live. She turned back to the accounts. November moved in steadily. The last wheat came in from Gavlock's farm, the largest delivery of the season. The mill ran hard for 8 days, and then settled to a slower pace as the orders thinned. She used the quieter time to work through the correspondence backlog and reconcile the Canmore contract against the fall totals. Harwick stayed through the month, which she had not expected. She had assumed he was seasonal. She learned instead that he had been with the operation for 3 years, and that he lived in the small building behind the shed that she had taken for storage. He was not, as she had first thought, a boy. He was 20 and had come from a farm north of Lethbridge and had nowhere particular to be, which was different from having no purpose, as he demonstrated daily. He was good with the wheel mechanisms in a tactile way she did not have, the way some people know machinery through their hands without being able to say how. When something in the gate mechanism behaved oddly, she sent Harwick before she looked at it herself, because he could tell in 30 seconds whether it was a problem or a sound that just needed living with. She told him so one afternoon when he came back in from the wheel, Housing having fixed the thing in the time it would have taken her to get her coat on. She said, "You know this equipment well." He said, "I've had time to," she said. "Don't undersell it. That's a particular kind of knowing." He looked briefly uncertain, as if he had expected something else. Then he nodded once and went back to what he was doing. She thought he would remember it. The snow came in the second week of December, a real snow, the kind that settled and stayed. The creek slowed but did not ice over, which meant the wheel kept running at reduced speed, enough for the light orders that came in from the post and from a new arrangement she had put together with a boarding house in Hartwell. It was a small account, but it was hers, in the sense that she had found it and written the letter and set the terms. And when the first payment came in, she transferred it to the ledger under a new heading she had made for standing orders. He saw the new heading that evening. He stood at the table, reading the ledger the way he sometimes did when he thought she was occupied elsewhere. She was at the stove and could see the table in the edge of her vision. He said, "The Hartwell boarding house." She said, "Yes." He said, "You wrote to them." She said, "We had capacity and they had a need." He set the ledger down. He turned and looked at her, and this time there was no recalibrating in it. He simply looked at her the way someone looks at something they have decided about. He said, "You could have mentioned it." She said, "I could have. I wasn't certain it would come through." He said, "When is it ever certain?" She turned from the stove. He was watching her with something that was neither criticism nor praise but was close to both. The way important things sometimes land between the categories you have prepared for them. She looked back at him for a moment. She said, "I'll mention it next time." He said, "I'd appreciate that." He held her gaze for a beat longer than necessary. Then he looked away, and she turned back to the stove, and the kitchen was quiet except for the sound of the wheel outside, and the snow coming against the window in the particular dry way it does when the temperature is serious. January. The wheel slowed further, and they reduced the runs to 3 days a week and used the others for repair work they had been deferring. She worked through the list in the small book in her coat pocket, item by item, checking each one against the accounts to see what could be done now and what would need to wait until the spring accounts filled again. There was an evening in the second week when the lamp on the table flickered, and she got up to trim it and found him already there with the scissors. And they stood at the same lamp at the same time, and neither of them stepped back. She could smell the cold on him from the shed. She trimmed the wick, and he set the lamp back, and they went back to what they had been doing. She did not think about it overmuch, but she noticed it the way she noticed most things, quietly, without yet knowing what to do with it. February. She wrote to her sister in Winnipeg, the first letter in 4 months. She did not describe the mill in detail. She said the work was steady. She said the winter had been colder than she'd expected, but that she was managing well. She said the position had turned out to be more than she had anticipated, which was true, and which she thought her sister would know how to read. Her sister wrote back. She asked whether the man was decent. She sat with that for a day before she wrote back. She wrote, "He is. More than that I am not yet ready to say, but he is." She folded the letter and mailed it on a Wednesday when she went into Hartwell for the boarding house account. On the way back, coming down the slope where Harwick had first pointed out the mill from a distance, she stopped the horse at the crest and looked down at it. The wheel was turning in the winter light, slower than in autumn but steady, the creek dark against the white. The smoke was going from the house chimney. The storage building sat solid at the south corner, roof intact. The place she had noted in her book, attended to now with new shingles that she had ordered in November, and that Harwick had put up on a dry day in early December. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she lifted the reins and brought the horse down the slope. Spring came late and fast, the way it does in the foothills, winter holding for weeks past what you expect, and then releasing everything at once. The creek came up with the melt, and the wheel ran at the highest pressure she had seen, and she stood at the millstone and felt the vibration in her feet and thought about the intake channel and the 3 days of hard work and the section under the footbridge, and she was glad they had done it when they had. New orders came in. Gavlock wrote in March with an increased commitment, the northeast quarter having expanded by lease through the winter. Mrs. Strathmore sent her spring order and included a note that said simply, "I hope the cold was not too bad. I expect we will see a good year." She wrote back and said she thought so too. There were 2 new hands hired in April, brothers named Culvain from across the river who knew grinding and kept to themselves in a respectful way. She trained them on the account procedures and the correspondence routing and found they were quicker than they appeared. By the end of their second week, they were managing the intake log without being asked. She managed the books. He managed the mill. The line between those 2 things blurred regularly enough that she stopped drawing it in her mind as a fixed border and started thinking of it more as a shoreline moving with the season. There was an evening in May when she was at the table with the spring ledger, and he came in from the wheel housing with a handful of early clover he had pulled from the bank of the creek. Not flowers, just clover. The kind that grew in the low wet ground near the water, with the small round heads still intact. He set it on the corner of the ledger without saying anything and went to wash his hands at the basin. She looked at it. It was not a gesture that asked for anything. It was a gesture that simply stated a fact the way he stated most things. She left it where it was. In June, the Alberta Territorial paper ran a short notice about the mill, the increased output, the new standing contracts, the channel work that had extended the running season by 6 weeks. They got most of the details right. They did not mention her by name, though they noted that the operation had added accounting and correspondence management in the past year. She cut it out and set it in the front of the ledger between the pages where she tracked the spring accounts. He found it there eventually, as she had known he would. He read it without comment and put it back. That was the summer the porch got a second chair. He had made it himself, over several evenings, in the same unhurried way he did most things, and one morning it was simply there beside the first, both chairs facing east, toward the creek and the wheel, and the long pale line of the mountains beyond. She sat in it that evening. He sat in the other. The wheel ran in the water below them, steady and even, the sound of it filling the yard, the way water always fills the spaces it is given. The light held for a long time. The mountains went from gold to gray to something without a name for the color, and the creek caught what was left of the sky. Neither of them said anything for a long while. When she finally went in, she left the door open behind her. He stayed a little longer. She could hear the wheel turning and the particular sound of the country settling into dark, and she thought she had not expected, when she had copied an address down on the inside of her wrist on a cold Tuesday in September, to find herself here. She was glad she had not hesitated longer.